Well, HMIC looked at how well forces in England and Wales are protecting victims of domestic abuse, and what we found is that they're not doing enough to keep victims of domestic abuse safe. There's much more that needs to be done. Lots of forces, every force in fact, told us that tackling domestic abuse is a priority for them, but it's just not translating into an actual reality. And sadly, tackling domestic abuse is still a poor relation to lots of other areas of police activity. That's not good enough, we say. That needs to stop, and the focus now needs to be on keeping victims of domestic abuse safe. There are a number of reasons why forces don't seem to be prioritising this, and in our report we put a set of recommendations to the police service, to national government, which sets out precisely how this needs to change so that victims are kept safe. It's really quite shocking that still today 3 women a fortnight are being killed by their partners or former partners, and the police have an absolutely vital role to play in making sure that when someone calls in because they are being perhaps attacked, that they turn up quickly, that when the responding officer arrives, that the victim is listened to, that she, and it normally is she because there are more women that are subject to abuse than men, that she's taken seriously, and that the police officer gathers evidence so that they can, if necessary, secure a conviction and help to keep the victim safe. Well, lots of practical things that the police officers can do. In the first instance, we want people that turn up to help victims, what we call response officers, so those that go out on the blue light. They need to understand what domestic abuse is about. They need to be properly trained. They need to make sure that where there's an opportunity to arrest the perpetrator, they arrest that perpetrator, because what victims have told us is that they want the abuse to stop. They want to be kept safe. They call the police hoping that someone's going to cross that threshold and keep them safe, and that's precisely what police officers need to do. They need to take the victims seriously, and they need to take all of the action you'd expect that they would take in investigating any other crime that they take in domestic abuse. Let me give you an example. We looked at how well police investigate domestic abuse crimes. We looked at an actual bodily harm where there will be an injury, and we looked at how many times a photograph is taken of that injury as evidence, really important evidence in the criminal justice process. It was in less than half the cases that we looked at, which we think is really, really poor and needs to change. The police are there to do a job, to keep the victim safe, to investigate the crime, to bring the offender to justice, and that's what we want to see happening from now on in. Well, what we say in the report is that domestic abuse has become the poor relation compared to other types of policing activity. There's a lack of kudos attached to this type of work. Perhaps officers would like to be going off and doing other things. We have an example of a victim telling us about how an officer is in her house dealing with her, and something comes over the radio and he says, "Oh, it's all right, it's a DV, I'll be out of here in a couple of minutes." And she thought, "But that's my life you're talking about." And so there's lots of things we need to do around education and training of officers, and them understanding the impact and the difference that they can really make to victims. I'm really positive because we haven't just identified the problems in this report, we've identified what needs to happen. And we're saying there needs to be a renewed national drive, there needs to be national oversight, the government needs to take responsibility for making sure that the recommendations that we've put in our report actually get acted on, and chief constables need to take personal responsibility for ensuring that their own organisations, everything that everybody does in the force, is focused on ensuring that victims of domestic abuse are kept safe. As we say in our report, domestic abuse in forces should be everybody's business, not somebody else's problem. Yeah, we found lots of positives within the report, but overall a very mixed picture. So the sorts of positive things that we found is that compared to a decade, the policing service has moved on. Police officers will turn up if a victim calls, they'll get there fairly quickly, and they'll intervene to keep the victim safe. And in fact, victim satisfaction about that initial action that police officers take is very high, and that's extremely positive. And there's also positive work that's now being done with the police and other agencies like councils and social work and the health service and education, where they work together to keep what's described as the highest risk victims of domestic abuse, so those that are at risk of serious harm or even death. Those agencies are working well together to actually provide a support service for the victims. So although this report is finding that there are things that the police can and must do to improve, we're still saying that it's important that if you are being subject to this terrible, terrible abuse that has such a blight on the lives of victims and children, that come forward to the police. And this is a wake-up call for the police, but we are positive and confident that the police will accept our findings and will take steps to improve things.